Our reading is from Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 3:6. Would you please stand as you're able for the reading of the gospel? One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. The word of God for the people of God. In our reading this morning, Jesus and his disciples are walking in a field, and a confrontation arises when the disciples are observed on the Sabbath plucking heads of grain from the field as they walk through. There were some Pharisees who took issue with this, seeing it as an infringement on the prohibition against working or reaping on the Sabbath. Was this a legitimate complaint, or were they just being petty? Reverend Leonard Sweet notes that the strict Sabbath observance was and is one of the great identifying features of Judaism. It safeguards a separate and sacred time away from the grinding duties of daily existence. Most importantly, however, the Sabbath is to be strictly observed simply because God commanded it that it be so. Sabbath observance is a symbol of the special obedient relationship between God and the chosen people of Israel. For the Israelites, to acknowledge the Sabbath is to recognize the ruling presence of God in their lives. So the complaint could be legitimate, but it also seems kind of petty, because it's not like they were harvesting the field, and the details of what is necessary to actually keep the Sabbath are not crystal clear in the law. It was generally up to the rabbi or the priest to determine what was considered work on the Sabbath. For example, Israelites were not supposed to walk more than a certain number of steps on the Sabbath day. But there were allowances for emergencies, as we will see. However, Jesus' response shifts the topic away from one of working on the Sabbath to one of need. He points out to what King David and his men did when they were in need on the Sabbath, by eating the bread of the presence in the temple and in front of the high priest at that. Here the disciples had been hungry, so they reached down to pluck some heads of grain and ate them. It's not like they were able to go home and have a Sabbath meal that had been prepared for them in advance, available to them, as most Jews would have on the Sabbath. They were on their way to preach the gospel, which takes precedent over religious traditions. Jesus followed up the complaint by saying, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." It makes me wonder if this was where he was going, why Jesus muddied the water by changing the topic and bringing in a different sort of action done by King David. It seems that simply responding to the original complaint with "the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath" was a stronger and more direct statement in answer to the original complaint. Now, Jesus was not saying that human beings can do whatever they want on the Sabbath. He is saying that people should follow the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law in looking at God's intent for the rules. It also sets up Jesus' authority over religious traditions and his ability to forgive sins on earth, which did not endear him to the Pharisees. Jesus is more concerned about sinners than he is about following traditional religious norms that isolate sinners from the righteous, which also effectively separates them from both the temple and God. Mark now takes us to the synagogue where Jesus encounters the man with a withered hand. The Pharisees were there watching him, looking for something to accuse him of. Jesus, knowing their hearts, proceeds with an object lesson on the nature of God and religion. He asks them whether it's lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill. But they remain silent. And Jesus became angry with their hard hearts and told the man to stretch out his hand. And the man did so and was healed. Now, it's not clear why the Pharisees are upset by this. Nobody has done anything here that would be considered work. Jesus had merely spoken, and the man had only stretched out his hand. So I'm not sure how there could be any Sabbath violation in what had occurred here. Perhaps the Pharisees were angry that Jesus had rubbed their nose in their hypocrisy and showed them up in the synagogue, which was supposed to be their home court. No rabbi would have called Jesus out even if his healing had involved work, for doing good and saving lives always takes precedent over Sabbath obligations. Anyone who truly cared about the law would have agreed with what Jesus did here. Jesus' strong reaction of anger and sadness to the people's hard hearts showed just how far his opponents had removed themselves from the true aspect of God's law and any possibility of accepting Jesus' teachings. They seemed more concerned with trivialities than with true worship. In looking back over the book of Mark thus far, we know that John the Baptist has already been imprisoned by Herod. And now we see the Pharisees involved in a political plot against Jesus, who exposed their malice when he challenged them to interpret the law and then healed the man with the withered hand without breaking it. Jesus had made the Pharisees look very petty, and they didn't like it. Now they must rid themselves of the one who has publicly shamed them. Jesus recognizes their intentions, and while they only plotted against Jesus on the Sabbath, which evidently was not a Sabbath violation, they had determined in their hearts to do evil and to kill, which are obvious violations of the law. The Pharisees were not concerned with the truth about God's will. They cared more about their traditions than with their appearance, appearing to be pious in front of those there in the synagogue. Now the scribes, Pharisees, and other religious authorities were not evil people as a whole. They performed a necessary function in interpreting the law so that people could use it to shape their lives to remain true to God's calling on their lives. Disputes over the proper interpretations of the law was a necessary part of Jewish life, just as legal disputes are a part of our lives today. Proper debate and investigation into the laws is not a threat. It is, however, when people try to use the law or religion for their own personal gain that things get out of whack and our moral centers become skewed. That is what we are seeing here. Now, people rarely set out to do evil things, but they often set out to do things that are in their own best interest. And when their interest takes precedent over the needs of others, that's when things start going badly for a society, especially when the religious or political leaders are profiting at the expense of poorer and weaker people. We need only to look at our own society to see how regard for God and religion has slipped away in favor of profit and pleasure. Many of us can remember that most stores would be closed on Sundays, and the family would spend at least part of the day together, honoring God and enjoying a day of restful activity. Now, however, most stores are open on Sunday because heaven forbid that any potential profit might go to someone else. And sporting activities have superseded church in terms of importance. Increasingly, Americans are acting in ways that do not serve or reverence God, but seek competition and pleasure instead of renewal and peace. We no longer have a day of rest. We have a day to run around and do as much as possible. And I get it. There are only so many hours in the day and so many days in a week. But can't we take one day or even one morning to rest and to honor God? It certainly seems like too much for most people to ask these days. When Jesus acted or debated, he always raised the larger issues of loving God and loving neighbor. When the love of debate or any other competition is loved more than God, then religion starts to die. For people care less about what happens to others than what matters to them. When our own interests take priority over God and God's works of love in the world, then religion is reduced to a matter of debate rather than being a model for Christ-like living. And we begin to take our place among the Pharisees who watched Jesus, but never really saw him for who he was or what he was doing. Americans seem to care more about blind patriotism than about other people, even other Americans, than they do about God. We used to care more about the rights of others than we did about making sure that others believed the way we do. We used to be able to agree to disagree with others, what they might have said, and have been willing to fight to the death for them to be able to say it. to stand up for freedom of speech and expression, which used to be a core value in the United States. But now it seems that we are too full of fear, hatred, and anger to listen to other views, to see if these other views have any value or validity. We are losing our way and losing the values that once made this country great. What we say we believe and our actions seem to be increasingly disconnected. Debate cannot hurt us if we remain rooted in our core beliefs and values, but are willing to keep an open mind. Blind allegiance, however, quickly turns us into mindless drones and reactionary Pharisees. When guns are more important than lives and profit more important than principle, and when appearance is more important than righteousness, we're in trouble. May we never become afraid of debating our ideas or truth, because truth will eventually win out. May love of God and love of neighbor take priority over love of profit and the favorable appearance of any interest group. May we seek righteousness rather than the appearance of being right to our friends. May we follow the example of Christ and love our neighbors and God as much or more than we love ourselves. May it be so for you and for me. Amen.